The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1992. Part 6. Continental Shelf. Article 76. Definition of the continental shelf. 1. The continental shelf of a coastal state comprises the seabed and subsoil of the submarine areas that extend beyond its territorial sea throughout the natural prolongation of its land territory to the outer edge of the continental margin, or to a distance of 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, where the outer edge of the continental margin does not extend up to that distance. 2. The continental shelf of a coastal state shall not extend beyond the limits provided for in paragraphs 4 to 6. 3. The continental margin comprises the submerged prolongation of the land mass of the coastal state, and consists of the seabed and subsoil of the shelf, the slope and the rise. It does not include the deep ocean floor with its oceanic ridges or the subsoil thereof. 4. A. For the purposes of this convention, the coastal state shall establish the outer edge of the continental margin wherever the margin extends beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, by either I. A line delineated in accordance with paragraph 7 by reference to the outermost fixed points at each of which the thickness of sedimentary rocks is at least 1% of the shortest distance from such point to the foot of the continental slope, or 2. A line delineated in accordance with paragraph 7 by reference to fixed points not more than 60 nautical miles from the foot of the continental slope. B. In the absence of evidence to the contrary, the foot of the continental slope shall be determined as the point of maximum change in the gradient at its base. 5. The fixed points comprising the line of the outer limits of the continental shelf on the seabed, drawn in accordance with paragraph 4, AI, and 2, either shall not exceed 350 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, or shall not exceed 100 nautical miles from the 2,500-meter isobath, which is a line connecting the depth of 2,500 meters. 6. Notwithstanding the provisions of paragraph 5, on submarine ridges, the outer limit of the continental shelf shall not exceed 350 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured. This paragraph does not apply to submarine elevations that are natural components of the continental margin, such as its plateau, rises, caps, banks and spurs. 7. The coastal state shall delineate the outer limits of its continental shelf, where that shelf extends beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured, by straight lines not exceeding 60 nautical miles in length, connecting fixed points, defined by coordinates of latitude and longitude. 8. Information on the limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured shall be submitted by the coastal state to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf set up under Annex II on the basis of equitable geographical representation. The Commission shall make recommendations to coastal states on matters related to the establishment of the outer limits of their continental shelf. The limits of the shelf established by a coastal state on the basis of these recommendations shall be final and binding. 9. The coastal state shall deposit with the Secretary-General of the United Nations charts and relevant information, including geodetic data, permanently describing the outer limits of its continental shelf. The Secretary-General shall give due publicity thereto. 10. The provisions of this article are without prejudice to the question of delimitation of the continental shelf between states with opposite or adjacent coasts. Article 77. Rights of the coastal state over the continental shelf. 1. The coastal state exercises over the continental shelf sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring it and exploiting its natural resources. 2. The rights referred to in paragraph 1 are exclusive in the sense that if the coastal state does not explore the continental shelf or exploit its natural resources, no one may undertake these activities without the express consent of the coastal state. 3. The rights of the coastal state over the continental shelf do not depend on occupation, effective or notional, or on any express proclamation. 4. The natural resources referred to in this part consist of the mineral and other non-living resources of the seabed and subsoil together with living organisms belonging to sedentary species, that is to say, organisms which, at the harvestable stage, either are immobile on or under the seabed or are unable to move except in constant physical contact with the seabed or the subsoil. Article 78. Legal status of the superjacent waters and airspace, and the rights and freedoms of other states. 1. The rights of the coastal state over the continental shelf do not affect the legal status of the superjacent waters or of the airspace above those waters. 2. The exercise of the rights of the coastal state over the continental shelf must not infringe or result in any unjustifiable interference with navigation and other rights and freedoms of other states as provided for in this convention. Article 79. Submarine cables and pipelines on the continental shelf. 1. All states are entitled to lay submarine cables and pipelines on the continental shelf, in accordance with the provisions of this article. 2. Subject to its right to take reasonable measures for the exploration of the continental shelf, the exploitation of its natural resources and the prevention, reduction and control of pollution from pipelines, the coastal state may not impede the laying or maintenance of such cables or pipelines. 3. The delineation of the course for the laying of such pipelines on the continental shelf is subject to the consent of the coastal state. 4. Nothing in this part affects the right of the coastal state to establish conditions for cables or pipelines entering its territory or territorial sea, or its jurisdiction over cables and pipelines constructed or used in connection with the exploration of its continental shelf or exploitation of its resources or the operations of artificial islands, installations and structures under its jurisdiction. 5. When laying submarine cables or pipelines, states shall have due regard to cables or pipelines already in position. In particular, possibilities of repairing existing cables or pipelines shall not be prejudiced. Article 80. Artificial islands, installations and structures on the continental shelf. Article 60 applies mutatis mutandis to artificial islands, installations and structures on the continental shelf. Article 81. Drilling on the continental shelf. The coastal state shall have the exclusive right to authorize and regulate drilling on the continental shelf for all purposes. Article 82. Payments and contributions with respect to the exploitation of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. 1. The coastal state shall make payments or contributions in kind in respect of the exploitation of the non-living resources of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles from the baselines from which the breadth of the territorial sea is measured. 2. The payments and contributions shall be made annually with respect to all production at a site after the first 5 years of production at that site. For the 6th year, the rate of payment or contribution shall be 1% of the value or volume of production at the site. The rate shall increase by 1% for each subsequent year until the 12th year and shall remain at 7% thereafter. Production does not include resources used in connection with exploitation. 3. A developing state which is a net importer of a mineral resource produced from its continental shelf is exempt from making such payments or contributions in respect of that mineral resource. 4. The payments or contributions shall be made through the authority, which shall distribute them to states parties to this convention, on the basis of equitable sharing criteria, taking into account the interests and needs of developing states, particularly the least developed and the landlocked among them. Article 83. Delimitation of the continental shelf. Between states with opposite or adjacent coasts. 1. The delimitation of the continental shelf between states with opposite or adjacent coasts shall be effected by agreement on the basis of international law, as referred to in Article 38 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice, in order to achieve an equitable solution. 2. If no agreement can be reached within a reasonable period of time, the states concerned shall resort to the procedures provided for in Part 15. 3. Pending agreement is provided for in Paragraph 1, the states concerned, in a spirit of understanding and cooperation, shall make every effort to enter into provisional arrangements of a practical nature and, during this transitional period, not to jeopardize or hamper the reaching of the final agreement. Such arrangements shall be without prejudice to the final delimitation. 4. Where there is an agreement in force between the states concerned, questions relating to the delimitation of the continental shelf shall be determined in accordance with the provisions of that agreement. Article 84. Charts and lists of geographical coordinates. 1. Subject to this part, the outer limit lines of the continental shelf and the lines of delimitation drawn in accordance with Article 83 shall be shown on charts of a scale or scales adequate for ascertaining their position. Where appropriate, lists of geographical coordinates of points, specifying the geodetic datum, may be substituted for such outer limit lines or lines of delimitation. 2. The coastal state shall give due publicity to such charts or lists of geographical coordinates and shall deposit a copy of each such chart or list with the Secretary-General of the United Nations and, in the case of those showing the outer limit lines of the continental shelf, with the Secretary-General of the authority. Article 85. Tunneling. This part does not prejudice the right of the coastal state to exploit the subsoil by means of tunneling, irrespective of the depth of water above the subsoil. To be continued.